Hello and welcome to Trailblazers, a series of conversations with Columbia University faculty whose ideas shape our world. I'm your host, Dustin Foote, and today we're talking about GDP and how we measure economic success with Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz is a professor of economics at Columbia University and a Nobel Laureate. He served as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bill Clinton, helping shape U.S. economic policy at the highest level. At the center of our conversation is his work moving beyond GDP as a dominant measure of economic performance. Through the development of a new economic dashboard, Professor Stiglitz has thought to rethink how we assess progress, incorporating factors like inequality, sustainability, and human well-being that traditional metrics often overlook. We spoke to Professor Stiglitz about why GDP falls short, his economic dashboard for the 21st century, and how we should understand economic success itself. Professor Stiglitz, welcome to Trailblazers.
Nice to be here.
Many of us think of GDP as the scoreboard for a nation's success. Why, in your opinion, is that not fully accurate?
Well, even the Simon Kuznets, who is thought of as the godfather of the GDP measure, recognized it was not a measure of well-being. It was a measure of market activity. And there can be a big disparity between well-being and market activity. I always think of the quote from Robert Kennedy, who said, GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And he was talking about, the kinds of human friendships and excitement and so forth, not the goods and services that we put into GDP. But more particularly, GDP doesn't take into account environmental degradation, resource depletion. It includes expenditures like on war that really don't give us any direct utility, defensive expenditures. It doesn't talk about how the goods and services produced in the economy are distributed. It doesn't talk about leisure. So many things that make up our well-being are just left out of that measure. So when the president of France, President Sarkozy, asked me to co-chair an international commission to rethink the issue and to make suggestions, it was something I had worked on when I had been in the Clinton administration. And this is really an opportunity to really develop that further.
You mentioned environmental degradation, and I'm curious, can you talk about how inequality and environmental degradation can actually make GDP rise even as well-being declines?
So, basically an example, right now, we're not doing as much as we should be doing to address the problems of climate change. The result of climate change is that we're going to have terrible storms, all kinds of environmental degradation. And we're going to have to spend a lot to repair the damage that these extreme weather events and their consequences result in. Well, the repair of the damage is included in GDP, but the loss from the damage is not subtracted from GDP. So you have a terrible hurricane that destroys billions and billions of dollars, and GDP will go up because we're spending all that to repair the damage. Of course, that makes no sense in terms of well-being. We're actually worse off, especially if people die. So that's just one, I think, very good example of the disparity between GDP and a good measure of well-being.
Can we go back a little? I'm curious to know when in your career you started questioning GDP as a measure of economic success.
Well, I don't know. I can't remember when I began to question it, but I do know that when I was in the Clinton administration, one of the early things I tried to do was to incorporate a measure of environmental degradation and resource depletion. So even by then, I was very fixated on that and saying, look, if our GDP is going up, but we're living off our resources and we're going to be poorer in the future or it's not sustainable, It makes absolutely no sense. Some of my earlier work on resource depletion also highlighted that, and that was actually 20 years earlier, back in the early 70s. I did work on the economics of resource depletion. So perhaps that was really when I began to think about these issues for the first time. But as a policy measure issue, I came back to it in the early 90s. Interestingly, I knew I was onto something important when several congressmen from the coal states got together and they said, if we continue to do work on that, they're going to cut off our funding. So when you get kinds of threats like that, you know you're doing something important.
I was wondering if you could talk about the nations who have implemented those strategies and how they're doing now.
Well, I was very pleased that after our report came out, it got an enormous amount of resonance and sometimes from surprising quarters. I was invited to give speeches to the Treasury in New Zealand and Australia. And you might say, the treasuries are not usually the parts of the government that are most sensitive to these kinds of discussions. And they explained, they want to do a better job of allocating resources in ways that reflect the impacts on the well-being of the citizens in their countries. So it was very natural, they thought, and I agree, for them to focus on well-being. A little bit later, the Prime Minister of New Zealand really took this whole issue up, the whole government of New Zealand. It's such a broad issue that inevitably you have to focus on one part of the agenda. And she focused on children and childhood deprivations and the consequences of that. I had a lot of very good interactions with the Scottish government, a lot of small governments where they're very much more close in touch with their constituents, with their citizens. We had a lot of strong interactions with the Scottish government, and they worked with a number of others to set up an alliance of countries focused on well-being. Some of the surprising aspects, not really surprising when you think about it, was that several more conservative governments, like in the UK, have taken up the issue because they realize that the importance of well-being, that should be at the center of any political agenda. And then finally, let me say I was pleased that the OECD, which is the organization that brings together all of the advanced countries and some of the higher income, middle income countries, decided to construct what they call it a better living index, try to incorporate some of the ideas and ways that one could effectively compare how well different countries are doing in delivering well-being measured in different ways.
If you could redesign the economic dashboard for now, the 21st century, what would that look like?
So first, let me comment on one aspect of the question. We recommended a dashboard.
Yeah.
That we felt very strongly after a lot of discussions that you could not summarize anything as complex as our whole economy, society, into a single number, that if were you to try to do that, you lose valuable information. And I sort of illustrate that by a simple example. You're driving a car, there are two dials that are really important. You want to know how fast you're going, but you also want to know how much gasoline you have, or how far your car can go before the battery gets discharged. If you add up those two numbers in any way, weighted average, you have nothing. You have garbage. So those are two quite separate numbers. And we felt the same way, that if you're going to assess how well an economy, society is doing, you want to know something about inequality, sustainability. You want to know, of course, you want to know about market income. You want to know about health. So we argued for a dashboard. We argued that different countries might put emphases on different things and therefore want to have highlight different things in their dashboard. For instance, in some countries or some developing countries, unemployment is a major, major problem. And if that's a major problem, you want to know how well you're doing in getting unemployment down. And others, it might be youth unemployment. I think in the United States, we have a major problem in health. Life expectancy is lower in the United States than in any of the other advanced countries. And health disparities are larger between rich and poor. And life expectancy over long periods of time have actually come down. So I would say that measures of health ought to be part of the dashboard. One of the things that very clear, again, in America, is insecurity, health insecurity, retirement insecurity, job insecurity. We've done assessments, and it's very clear those insecurities are very high among large parts of our population. In countries in Europe where it is just accepted that you have a public provision of healthcare, there's not the health insecurity, where it's just accepted that their systems of social protection are an essential part of the way society functions. There's less economic insecurity. So among those countries, insecurity is not the top issue. It isn't as important. Changes in security are not as important as they would be in the United States, where because of deficiencies, very major deficiencies in our systems of social protection, insecurity is a big thing. And then finally, inequality more generally is something that is getting more and more attention for the obvious reason that inequality is getting larger and larger. And so we want to understand better the nature of that inequality, the oligarchs at the top, the poverty at the bottom, the evisceration at the middle. And so metrics that give us insights into what is happening on inequality is another important dimension. One more thing, countries inevitably start comparing themselves with each other, and these dashboards are useful for gaining insights into how to make those comparisons. Differences that play an important role in those comparisons, therefore, ought to be part of the dashboard. So, for instance, two things that explain a lot of the difference between GDP per capita in the United States and GDP per capita in many countries in Europe is that we have a very, very inefficient healthcare system. So we spend almost 20% of GDP on healthcare and get worse outcomes than a country like France that spends about 11%, a country like Singapore that spends, I think, about half that amount. And so you want to highlight that a lot of that extra GDP that US has is a reflection of an inefficient healthcare system. It's not really delivering better outcomes. Another important part of the difference between the United States and France and some other countries is that we work a lot more. And, different societies can make different decisions about how much work, how much leisure, whether they should have vacations or not. These are judgment. I don't want to make those judgments. But if you're trying to understand why GDP is higher in the United States than it is in France, at least an important part of that is people just work more, have less vacation. I know from talking to people in France, their vacations are a very important part of their lives.
We have one final question for you, Professor Stiglitz. We like to end these conversations on a light note, so with that in mind, we thought it would be fun to ask, you're an economist, and New York is a very expensive city. What's the best bargain or deal you have ever found here?
Well, I think probably the best deal are some of the things like the free movies, plays, particularly in the summertime, that just are all over New York City. They're just wonderful.
Trailblazers is a production of Columbia University's Office of Public Affairs. You can listen to our other conversations on Columbia's Impact and Innovation website, our Vimeo page, or our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening.